We're going to be continuing chapter 1, talking about biological organization and some of the common themes that we see in all living organisms. So we talked about some of these already. One is organization. It's sort of stepping up from molecules to organelles to cells to tissues and organs, all the way up to the level of the ecosystem and the biosphere. And then we talked about continuity of information. So this is passing our genetic information on to the next generation. And now we're going to get into the next couple of themes: transfer of energy and matter, interaction with the environment, and evolution. And for the most part, I'm going to go through these a little bit more quickly than the other two, just because they're, at least C and D there, are not the main focus of our semester, but we do talk about these. So we'll get into those. So all living organisms interact with their environment in a way that transfers energy and transfers matter through the ecosystem. So life requires the consuming, the converting of energy into different sources. And that ultimately, the energy on Earth ultimately comes from the sun. And all living organisms depend on plants and other photosynthetic organisms to absorb that light energy and to convert it into a usable form. So we'll talk about how this process works once we get to chapter 7 and 8. But in general, that sunlight energy is converted into a chemical energy, and then those photosynthetic organisms can use that energy, or it might be consumed by the next trophic level up, those organisms that eat photosynthetic organisms, your herbivores, your insects. And then they take in that energy, transform it, and use it for themselves. And then ultimately, energy is lost out of the system. So energy enters, flows through, and is lost ultimately as heat. Everything that an organism does requires energy. That could be moving, reproducing, growing, performing cellular work, maintaining the body. All of that requires energy, and the ultimate source of that energy is the sun. And so all living organisms are therefore dependent on those that can harness that energy and transform it into usable energy. Living organisms also transform matter, move matter around an ecosystem, and we'll think of this as chemicals. So, excuse me. If we look here, we see this blue circle of chemical cycling. This is showing plants absorbing nutrients from the soil. They are incorporating it into their cells, into their tissues, into their organs. And then they're either using those chemicals, or again, they're being consumed by some sort of consumer. In this case, we have that caterpillar that is taking in those chemicals as it eats the leaf, incorporating it into their body. Matter and chemicals flow through the ecosystem as a cycle. So they're not lost ultimately like energy, but they're taken in by the plants, transferred to the consumers, and then ultimately when those plants or those consumers die, they're returned back to the soil as decomposers break them down and release their nutrients. Next, all living organisms interact with their environment. And they interact in a variety of different ways. And depending on what organism they're interacting with, they might interact one way and then differently in another situation. So organisms interact not only with the other living organisms in their environment, the other animals, the other plants, they also interact with the non-living components. So weather affects them, the nutrient availability in the soil, nutrients such as water and things like that all impact the way that organisms interact with their environment. But when you're talking about two living organisms, there are a couple of major ways in which these two organisms can interact. And they're just like any interaction that two people would have. You can have interactions that are mutually beneficial. That means that both parties gain something from this. So our example here would be the sea turtle, and we've got all of these fish that are eating parasites and algae and things off of the turtle. So that is providing those fish with a food source, and it is providing cleaning for that turtle to keep its shell and its skin nice and healthy. There are lots of mutually beneficial examples. Another example might be bees pollinating a flower. So the bees get pollen and possibly nectar, or birds might get nectar and in the process transfer pollen for that flower so that it can continue its reproductive cycle. You can have mutually beneficial relationships. Another example would be those wolves down in the center working together to take down that elk. So there are a variety of ways that organisms can work together and benefit from one another. Next, we have a situation where the relationship might be beneficial to only one. So a really good example of this is predation. So we've got that leopard that has taken down the gazelle. You've got those wolves working together to take down those elk. These are beneficial to the organism that is taking down its prey. And therefore getting its food source. Obviously, it's not beneficial to the animal that is killed, but that's sort of one big example of beneficial to only one. There are a variety of other examples as well, but predation is kind of the easiest one to see. And then you have interactions that are detrimental to both. So this might be fighting over a food source. If both animals get hurt in the fight, one might ultimately gain the resource, but it might be hurt in the situation as well. So here we have Dall sheep. They are most likely fighting over a mate. So ultimately, one is probably going to win out and get the mate. But if they're both hurt in that process, it's detrimental to both. You might also have a fight over a food or a resource where one animal gets killed or one animal gets badly injured, the other one gets badly injured. So you might have this situation where neither one is benefiting. So there are a lot of different examples of each of these. I encourage you to think about these. Think about in the world around us, not just people, but in the environment around us, what sort of interactions you see. How are they beneficial to one or the other or both, or how are they detrimental? So humans also have a huge impact on the living organisms around them. And one example of that is global warming. So this is a situation where humans have driven this change to the global ecosystem, caused this increase in temperature, and there are a variety of reasons for global warming. One of the major ones is human impact. So global warming is a directional change in the climate that lasts over a long period of time. And in this case, this instance of global warming that's occurring now is an increase in temperature, and it's a rapid increase in temperature. And what happens is it causes the average global temperature to increase, and then you get melting of glaciers and ice caps and things like that. And it causes a variety of problems. It raises sea levels, it shifts weather patterns, it expands the warmer regions farther north. And this is important because it affects the habitats in which organisms live. So the main cause of the human impact on global warming is burning of fossil fuels. So this releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which traps heat at the surface, which increases the average temperature. This causes wind and precipitation changes. We've noticed a change in extreme weather, more strong hurricanes, more severe weather in the Midwest. And when you have these huge regional impacts on weather, you impact the organisms that live there. So one example would be polar bears with ice melting in the northern regions, and you have ice platforms that these polar bears depend on. They normally will polar bears will use them for hunting seals and things like that. When those melt, these polar bears lose their hunting grounds. They lose the traditional areas where they hunt, and so they are losing food sources or the ability to hunt those food sources, and that's causing a drop in polar bear population. Um, as you have this change in global patterns, you have habitats change. So some organisms can expand their ranges to areas where they previously were not. Others can't adapt quickly enough. The populations can't adapt quickly enough to the change. And so you see a decline in species number. And you see a change in behavior in some animals that will also affect their population range and their population numbers. So this lizard we have here is a spiny lizard. He lives in the Chihuahuan Desert and the Sonoran Desert of Mexico. And as temperatures increase, this lizard has begun to spend more time in the shade. It's feeling hotter, it wants protection from the sun, and this increased time in the shade has decreased its food intake, which has caused a drop in reproduction for these lizards, and so their population is declining. And in fact, scientists have noticed a drop of over 12% since 1975. So as temperatures have increased, these animals are spending more time in the shade. This is impacting their behavior. It's impacting their reproductive success. So finally, we get to evolution. Now, evolution is something that works at the population level. So individuals do not evolve. And so this is kind of a common theme in biology, not because it affects individuals, but it affects populations of individuals and their ability to change over time and change with the environment that they're presented with. So evolution is the idea that organisms on Earth are modified descendants of common ancestors. So this means that if you go back, two similar populations or two similar species have a common ancestor, and those two populations have split, and as a population they have adapted to their specific environments, and therefore they have acquired differences between those two populations. Maybe those differences are enough to become a new species, but they have changed to fit their environment. And the first one to publish this idea and amass a large amount of data on this was Charles Darwin. So Charles Darwin spent a lot of time in the mid to late 1800s observing natural populations and sort of amassing evidence for this theory of evolution. And his two main points were descent with modification and natural selection. So descent with modification is basically that definition of evolution that we just talked about. It's this idea that closely related species are similar because they came from a common ancestor, so that's the descent part, but they are modified to fit their environment. So they have changed over time. So this tells us that more closely related species are going to have more similar characteristics. And it also shows us that even though they're related, if they face different environmental challenges, they're going to, populations are going to be different. And this process is due to something called natural selection. So natural selection is when environmental pressures cause organisms to be more or less suited for their environment. And this allows for the accumulation of those suitable traits in a population. And that is why different populations of organisms can and do change to fit their environment. So evolution is really important because this theory is really important because it explains not only why we see organisms that appear to be similar, but also the huge diversity of organisms that we see on Earth. So evolution and this idea of descent from a common ancestor shows that we have the ability for organisms have the ability, and their populations have the ability to change over time and to produce this huge diversity of organisms where you have individuals that are uniquely adapted to their environment. The fossil record, Darwin's evidence, and just looking around natural populations today show us that there's this huge diversity. But evolution is also important because it brings that diversity back to a common ancestor. We already talked about this universal genetic code, this genetic information that is shared among all living organisms. But the unity part of evolution shows us that related organisms have similar characteristics, and that's because they came from a common ancestor. So here we have the example of 4 limbs in 4 different mammals. We have human hand, a cat forelimb, a whale flipper, and a bat wing. And if you look, we have this huge diversity in the shapes of these bones, but you can see the same types of bones are labeled there in different colors, and they're essentially arranged in the same order. Now they do have different shapes, that's the diversity. They have different shapes because of the way that those limbs are used, but they're all similar because they come from a common mammalian ancestor. So as part of this idea of evolution, um, we need to be able to classify all of this diversity. So evolution explains why there's diversity, but it also gives us the ability to explain how organisms are related and therefore to classify them. So biologists group organisms based on their similarities. Now this can be physical similarities, it can be genetic similarities, looking at the DNA sequence. It can be how particular structures are used or how they were used in a common ancestor. And so again, we have this example of the 4 limbs in mammals, and they are all similar because they come from a common mammalian ancestor. And that allows us to look at other organisms, see these similar shapes, and understand how all of these organisms can be related. And then using DNA analysis, you can look at the DNA sequences of these organisms and pick out similarities. And so again, just like similarity in structure, the more similar the structure is, the more closely related the organism probably is. And then you can also look at DNA and say, hey, we've got this gene that is very, very similar in these 2 different organisms, and therefore they must be more closely related. So when we look at all of the living organisms on Earth, the most basic classification are the 3 domains. So the domains are sort of the largest category of living organisms, the largest 3 categories of living organisms. So we have 3 categories. We have the bacteria, the archaea, and the eukarya groups. Now bacteria and archaea are going to be our prokaryotic groups, and eukarya are our multicellular organisms. Bacteria and archaea also have kingdoms. In this series, Biology 101 and Biology 102, we don't get into the kingdoms of the bacteria too much. 102 does just a little bit. But for the most part, we focus on our multicellular organisms in this class. The major groups of multicellular organisms are the plants, the animals, the fungi, and the protists. So bacteria and archaea are our prokaryotic domains. There are these 3 major domains, 2 of which are prokaryotes. Bacteria, one of our domains, is the most diverse set of organisms. Bacteria inhabit basically any environment that you are going to encounter on the planet. Extreme environments, your gut, the soil, your refrigerator, whatever you can think of, there's probably a bacteria that lives there. They are all single-celled organisms, so remember this means that they are prokaryotic, they don't have a membrane-bound nucleus, they don't have membrane-bound organelles, but they still perform all of those functions that are required for life. They're still considered single-celled organisms. Bacteria tend to get a bad rap. People tend to think of the ones that cause infections and disease and things like that. But in fact, most bacteria are either completely harmless to humans or actually beneficial. So a lot of bacteria are involved in nutrient cycling and decomposition in our soils, and so they're really important in sort of this whole food web of life and bringing those chemicals back into the soil, decomposing organisms that have died so that plants can take them back up and transfer those chemicals throughout the ecosystem. And there are many, many beneficial bacteria. There are millions of bacteria in your gut right now that are in a symbiotic relationship. That's a mutually beneficial relationship that are helping your body break down foods. They're providing things like vitamins for you as they break down your foods. They are actually helping your immune system, helping to fight off infections and things like that. So keep in mind that bacteria are not all bad. There are absolutely some bad ones. For example, E. coli is one that often gets a bad rap, but most people have it in their gut, just working to break down your food, help in healthy digestion. But then there are some strains of E. coli that cause massive sickness. So, just be aware. Keep in mind that in general, bacteria are our friends, not our enemies. Our other major group of prokaryotes are the archaea group. So the archaea group are actually quite different from bacteria. And these archaea are prokaryotes that tend to live in extreme environments. So if you think about deep sea thermal vents, hot springs, things like that, they are the organisms that are adapted to these really specialized environments. And in fact, some scientists think that archaea are actually a closer ancestor to the eukaryotic cell than bacterial cells. So finally we get to our eukaryotic organisms. These are our multicellular organisms, although not all of them are multicellular. We're going to talk about the ones first that are definitely easy to see multicellular. And the eukaryotic domain is broken down into essentially 4 kingdoms. You have the plants, animals, and fungi, and they are multicellular organisms that are distinguished by the way that they take in nutrients. So these 3 groups are very, very different on the surface, but really the main difference is their energy acquisition. So plants are our major photosynthetic organisms on Earth. They take in their energy from the sun and convert it into chemical energy. So they are our primary producers. Then we have our animals. These guys are going to be the consumers. So they eat other living things. They might eat plants like that I think that's actually a gorilla, like that gorilla there, eating the plant. They might be primary consumers, or they might eat other animals. They might be secondary or tertiary consumers, but they are eating other living organisms. And then finally we have fungi. These are organisms that basically decompose their food. So fungi will secrete a enzyme sort of solution into the environment around them and decompose the things around them and then absorb their nutrients. And then last we have the protist, kingdom Protista. The protist kingdom is actually unique in that they are not their own group. They're kind of distributed throughout our plants, animals, and fungi. The protists have a huge diversity of organisms. Some are photosynthetic, some are consumers. And the key thing about protists, though, is that they can be single-celled eukaryotic organisms, or they are simple multicellular organisms. So they don't really fall into the kind of same general makeup as our plants, animals, and fungi. They're much more simple, but they are also much more diverse. And like bacteria, they're found in a variety of environments. A lot of them are found in water environments. Um, you can see there's a picture here that has a variety of different protists in it. That kind of big blobby one there is probably an amoeba. So this one goes around and consumes other organisms. Some of those are probably performing photosynthesis. So they do a lot of the same things that our other eukaryotic domain organisms do, but they're much more simple.